And I don't know if we're recording, but we're recording, so that way everybody knows. Barb, you want to go ahead and get started? We'll turn it right over to you to jump into this.
Sure, thank you. So thank you all for bearing with me to this point. We've tried to, before this meeting, make a push to give you an idea of what the final regulations would look like as a package. But there's still obviously some major, issues I want to make sure we have consensus on as a committee. So today I wanted to cover the items in the summary. There was a one-page summary. I hope you got that, but there's a hierarchy we're proposing for conservation assets. When you look at a conservation subdivision, the main point is to identify areas of land that would benefit from conservation through an easement, through a permanent easement, and to really zero in on those types of resources. And it's a narrower set of resources than it's in the NRI. The NRI is very broad, and the planning board and all boards need to consider impacts on those resources. But with the conservation subdivisions, we really wanted to zero in on land resources that would benefit from preservation through a conservation easement. So that's what we've proposed is in a hierarchy. And so we've developed a table, class 1, 2, 3, of conservation assets that are most relevant and should be preserved. So we'll go through the hierarchy. We've kept most of the legalese and many of the broad parameters of reviewing a conservation subdivision and changed some of the others. So the threshold for requiring a conservation subdivision is 10% of the land has resources that would benefit from being preserved with an easement. A conservation subdivision is required, and it's optional for other subdivisions. So we've prioritized in the rewrite developing a plan for the conservation assets first. The first thing you do is look at the site and look at the assets, the resources that are on the site, and develop goals for those resources and how they can be preserved in the context of being part of a development project. So those steps are prioritized, followed by calculating the number of lots permitted, followed by the standards for conservation, and then the standards for development. So I wanted to go through all of these sections, starting with the hierarchy of conservation assets. So at this time, I'm going to share my screen and put that up. There we go. All right, should I zoom in more, make that bigger?
That's good.
That's
good.
Yeah, it's good.
My old eyes can see that.
Well, we're all close, when we do a PowerPoint, everything's got to be blown up. But so these are the classes that, we're proposing for a hierarchy. And we've referenced the natural resource inventory maps for each of these that are mapped. So certainly, as you have in the regulations now, constrained and unbuildable lands are really excluded from the calculations. And those include regulated wetlands, flood hazard areas that are on the FEMA maps, slopes 15% or more, which are restricted from development by your zoning, land within 100 feet of streams or 25 feet of the lake, again, restricted by your zoning. The current regulations include other unbuildable or constrained land, and these would be, they're not part of the NRI, but they would be, site specific, whether there's an easement or other restriction on developing those areas. So that would be the constrained or unbuildable lands.
So Barb, can I ask a question? Do you want us to just ask questions as we go, or do you want to?
I wanted to pause on this to see, we'd want to kind of finalize or, get your input back, and we'll finalize after, see how far we get on the hierarchy.
Okay, so it's not that I have a problem with anything that you have there in the class 1, but I had a question that came up from a developer. And this may be the exception rather than the rule, but a developer was concerned because there was a piece of parcel that they were considering that was a rather large parcel that had a rather unusually large amount of constrained lands being slopes of 15% or greater. And the complaint was, but we're setting that all aside and you're not giving us credit for it. So I know that, that's kind of the back and forth, but I at least want to bring up that point because that was a recent conversation that I had.
And other towns do it differently and count the constrained land as part of the preserved areas. And that's, really a policy question. If you have in your zoning, you can't build on it. And now you're giving them credit for it. So that's, really the crux of it. I definitely see both sides of that. Any thoughts from the group?
Yeah, if I could chime in, I was concerned about that 15% slope, and I know it is in our current conservation easement law, but since then, we've passed a steep slopes law that kind of works around, or work around isn't the right term, but allows building on slopes, but talks about how to preserve and how to do it correctly. Let's face it, we've got a hell of a lot of land in the town of Canandaigua that's more than 15% slopes, and much of it's buildable and buildable ecologically appropriately. So I'm concerned that with our present steep slopes law, we can accommodate or monitor certainly slopes at 15%. That's not a big deal. That's what, 1.5 foot maybe? That's not think about it. We've got those kind of slopes damn near everywhere except the north part of town.
What do you think about moving that to class 2?
I would recommend that.
Any opposition to that?
No.
I thought.
And that way it counts towards the density calculation, but it's one of the assets that's recommended to be preserved. It would be, recommended to be preserved 80% as part of the conservation subdivision.
And if I could comment also, and if we do it interchangeably, on the class 2, sometimes we call them high priority and other times we call priority conservation assets. I would suggest that high priority is redundant. Just take off high and just call them priority assets and then other conservation assets, and do that throughout the document.
That's a good suggestion, but yeah, I will follow up with that. Okay.
Barbie should probably be a little more specific as to what is a stream. I know we passed recent regulations regarding streams as being anything from a class C stream. So maybe the bed of a class C stream is defined by I guess it's a DEC.
Yeah,
Whatever our regulations say.
Class 3 or higher. They
Well,
are mapped in the natural resource inventory, so there is a map of those.
Yeah, and that's what our development office uses for determining if a setback is required. If it is a class, I think it's C, it's not 3. I think it's a class C stream. It used to be if it was a blue line stream, but then everybody was having problems determining whether it was intermittent or always flowing. And I think they went with the class C. Good.
And
Okay.
believe those are all of the streams you have in your town. A class D is degraded, so hopefully you don't have any of those ever. But those are also mapped in the natural resource inventory by class, so you can see that map as well.
Which helps determine going back and determining if it is in fact a constrained piece of land.
Right. What's interesting with the maps are, and if you look at some of the aerials and the overlays, the boundaries of the stream are very, the maps are different from the aerial photos.
Mm-hmm.
So it really needs to be checked, well, that's in your zoning right now.
Well, that usually gets tied down when the applicant gets in a specific piece of land and starts to do a survey, because he can define the actual stream bed.
And what's interesting about the stream corridor is that you have a lot of places, that are farmed, for example, where you don't have 100-foot buffer. I mean, there might be just a few trees along the side of the stream bank. It doesn't go 100 feet or much less 150 feet. But that's consistent with your regulations now. And then the class 2 would include the recommended buffer, which would go to 150 feet. So it's an additional 50-foot wide on either side of the stream.
Okay.
As a priority conservation asset. And I just wanted to check in, maps of ridges and hilltops. Is there an official map, or is that still something that you do case by case and look at it?
Didn't the Saratoga review have a map of ridges and ridgelines and hilltops and so on and so forth?
Barbara, I think the answer is nobody wants to answer your question within a 100-foot pole. So
Yeah, I think that always was the question, and one of the reasons why the ridgeline guidelines and everything kind of took a back seat is because we didn't have an official map. But I think since then, since we've had the NRI and the mapping there, I think there may be a reason why we have accepted those as our official maps. Okay, so they may not be as clear maybe or definitive as something that the ridgeline guidelines actually wanted to display, but there's always been an issue about how far away do we look at it, what's a ridgeline? It's a very nebulous kind of a thing there. So I don't know what we'll do about it.
Well, it can be done case by case, and you can look, you can do a visual analysis when you have a site.
Yeah.
What we did for the NRI was mapped or modeled lands that are visible from Canandaigua Lake, and that showed them in general, but it's more of a reference map than a map that you can use to measure things.
Yeah.
We'll keep it as listed that way. So we've really included as the highest priority the rare and vulnerable ecological communities, which in the town are your silver maple, ash, swamp, and floodplain forest, woodlands within the strategic forest protection area, farmland, active farmland within the strategic agricultural protection area, the stream buffers, and now the slopes and ridges. And those are the highest priority, or the priority assets. And the other assets are basically the other land areas included in the natural resource inventory, as well as resources that you might identify on a site. A site that adjoins other open space, adjoins other protected lands, some opportunities for recreation, scenic landscapes. Those aren't necessarily mapped to the site specific level, but when you have a project, you can identify those on the site and make sure those are included in the conservation plan. So most of your undeveloped land is going to have all of these resources.
Is there a difference between active agricultural land and agricultural land in terms of what we want to protect?
Yeah, and I think your the way it's worded now is farmed within the last 2 years.
Right.
I think that makes sense.
So we should correct it on both class 2 and class 3.
Barb, just for clarification, in class 2, I see the strategic farmland protection area. In class 3, I see the Paddleford Brook Greenway. There certainly is a big chunk of properties that would be in both. How would you, just for clarification, is it land within the Paddleford Brook Greenway, not in the strategic agriculture protection area?
Well, it might, there might be some lands that don't have farmland that are also within the Greenway.
Right, but I'm saying for a property that's in both.
Yeah, I was, this is kind of, I wasn't sure about that one because it's not an asset. I mean, it's open space, but it probably will fall into another category unless it's already disturbed.
Or you could just leave it and say land within the Paddleford Brook Greenway, not within the strategic agriculture protection area. Yeah, or sure, are the categories. Yeah.
It's a good way to handle it.
Yeah.
Okay,
It
because
works.
the idea was that you're trying to develop a critical mass of open space, you know, and that's your open space area, so it was a higher priority. I think you'll find that most of them are included in other categories, but, you know, that's a just in case. Great point. Anything else on this hierarchy? I'll stop and do a different one then. So the hierarchy prioritizes those, and then, you know, we're talking about the threshold. So if 10% of the land is in class 1, 2, or 3, a conservation subdivision would be required. I think you'll find that in most development proposals that have any kind of open space, unless they're previously developed land. So the process would be to map and describe each type and specify the conservation goals for each type of asset. So if you have you know, steep slopes, for example, there's development and conservation goals for that, not to develop, maintain vegetation and so forth. If it's a forest, to maintain the integrity and the mass of the forest and not build roads or driveways through the forest, to maintain, you know, that intact with a buffer preferably. Obviously, if it's a wetland, to maintain that intact with a buffer. There's a stream corridor to maintain and even enhance and replant areas along the stream would be a recommended goal. So we start when we look at a site with the conservation plan and develop goals, and then consider how that land could be developed in light of those goals. And I have let me put my other, okay, here we go. I'm going to show you how I propose computing the number of residential lots. Okay. So to compute, the 40% needs to be preserved. We take the total parcel size. Well, take the total parcel size minus the constrained land, divide that by the land preserved by easement minus the constrained land, and that has to equal 40%. And that's the amount that would need to be preserved. So we're excluding the constrained land, which is the class 1 computations. And this is a critical, you know, calculation for, you know, the point of view of the developers. And it's kind of gets to what we were talking about up front. You know, we excluded the steep slopes, but we're still including regulated wetlands, 100 feet from the stream, and anything with an easement or a stormwater or other, you know, unbuildable. It's not included in the calculation at all. Are we in agreement on this?
Yeah,
Okay, good.
I am.
That's a critical part of it. Okay. And
This mapping and determination of the constrained lands, stupid question, but that's to be done by the applicant?
sure,
and-
yes,
Okay,
yes,
so
that's
you know, there's no
that's
town
the-
resources required to go out and have to do this and then show the applicant, this is what you're constrained by. Okay, it's done by the applicant and checked by the development office.
checked
Right.
by the town, of course, and your consultants, absolutely.
Can I just piggyback on that for a quick second and follow up? So what about, I know we have done a lot of mapping over the last few years. We've got a lot of, and actually, Barbara, you've done a lot of the work for us, and thank you so much. But even like, I believe in the class 2 category, you have listed the silver, maple ash, that sort of thing. What happens if we have maps that say that it's there, but the developer says it's not? I mean, who is the planning board? Do we have language that gives the planning board the ability to make that final call? Or, you know, I guess my thinking there is that way, if the planning board deems it appropriate, they certainly have the flexibility to hire an outside entity or something or other to make the final call.
Yes, the maps are a guide, clearly, and what's there on the ground is the reality, and that's what you need to make decisions based on. So yes, that should be clear that the maps are a guide. A lot of those land cover maps are old, 10 years old or so. So some things have changed, and we mentioned the streams. Those locations aren't correct. When you look at the ground, they're not correct as far as even the location, the flow of the stream. So what's on the ground is what you're making decisions based on. So the applicant may say one thing, but we would like you, really to consider, and we'll talk about this at our NRI training next week as well, to have an ecologist actually go and look at it from an ecology point of view. Like these are, what you really have as far as a natural system here, an ecosystem. And this is, the areas and the practices that you want to encourage or require to maintain those ecosystems if possible. I mean, if you have a 2-acre wood, what can that support? I mean, that's really a question for an ecologist. But it does need to be properly mapped, and that will require a field checking and field mapping. Similar to your wetland.
I see where the
delineation.
planning board would rely on the mapping, the NRI mapping, and then that hopefully that is conservative enough to put the burden then on the applicant if he wants to challenge it to go out and provide documentation that shows that it's not as extensive as what the mapping shows.
Yeah, I mean, you might find some changes that there's more woods than there used to be too. So, it's important to look at a current aerial photo as well as the mapping.
It's analogous to a floodplain. A lot of times you look at a floodplain map and the applicant says, well, wait a minute, that floodplain's not that wide. And he goes out and does a hydrologic study, and he comes in showing that the limits of the floodplain are less than what we're showing. So I would see the same sort of application here.
Exactly, and wetlands as well, especially with federal wetlands, which, the maps we have of federal wetlands are clearly only a guide. They're not a regulatory tool. It's a suggestion that there are wetlands on the site, and in order to determine whether there are or not and how big they are, you need to do a delineation.
Can I ask a question? How often are these maps updated and changed? Because especially woodlands, and especially nowadays when trees are dying and they need clearing. So essentially they could become cleared land depending on what type of tree species is in the woodlands. So I'm wondering how often they're updated and how are they updated? Who does that?
Well, they haven't been updated since the land cover mapping was done by Finger Lakes Community College in the early 2000s.
Well,
I can't remember when it was, but they haven't been updated in a while. So they are a guide and need to be, checked.
So that needs to be taken into account. That needs to be taken into account when, okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's why field verification, I think, is so important in this case, because we haven't had that verification or those updates of those maps. But it is one of the goals in the comprehensive plan update to make sure in the natural resources section, the goal is to update the maps soon, because we understand that they haven't been done for a while, and there are a lot of changes out there that we really could be on top of. So that's going to be, it's a project of the CIC if they want to undertake it, whenever in 2022, to figure out a process, how we update our maps, when we update them, and how to move forward with that, because I do think it's critical since we're redeveloping here a code which is going to be relying on those maps tremendously so. Now I have another question about steep slopes. They're a part of the steep slope law, which actually says anything over 40% is restricted. So how do we account for that in unbuildable? I think we need to look at that code and see what those ramifications are, because they could be in the, in the constrained lands for the developer. And once it gets into just category 2, you have a different configuration for that. And, I'm just getting a little nervous about how that's actually going to work out in the, in actual, designation calculations.
I think you're saying it might make sense to include slopes of 40% or more in the unbuildable.
Exactly, because those are constrained. That's an unbuildable, as our code stands now anyway. It's an unbuildable, topography there. So anyway, yeah.
Does that
So-
make sense?
Let me ask a question about that. So yes, I understand the thought process here of trying to make sure those are unbuildable. But again, if the developer has a large piece of land, and what happens if a big percent, and again, this may be the exception rather than the rule. I mean, we really might be getting into the weeds here, because there's probably not that many parcels that would fall into this category, but a rather large parcel that has a unusually large number of very steep slopes. Do we give them the ability to have greater density in those areas that would be buildable? Because obviously they would be protecting those steep sloped areas. I just posed the question. I don't have an answer. I'm just thought-provoking question here.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of those would be 40% though. So I guess I'm trying to picture the sloping lands.
It's going to be in particular areas of our town where this is going to occur. And I don't know about it actually being land that would be suitable for subdivision, but it's possible. Probably more like individual lots, that kind of thing, maybe small subdivisions, 3 or less lots. But, like Doug said, this is just, think about what could happen here. That's how kind of what I'm going at is, what's the possibility if we don't look at it now?
And the thing that I'll tell you, I just had this conversation, and what I said to the developer is you always have relief through the zoning board to prove that it's an exception.
Sure.
But don't we as a town, the people that do this, have an idea where the 40% slopes are in the town? And I mark that area. And then if you have a developer come in with a plan for something in that area, you would know to take a better look at things and see if it adheres to the plan.
Are you seeing this map now?
Yeah.
So the darkest maroon is the 40% and steeper.
And the
So
reason why I'm concerned, we're talking about Menteith Creek here. And, not that someone's going to go and build a development there, but all of the creeks, all of the gullies are, probably, the darkest areas there. And those are the most, vulnerable. It's just a matter of, making sure nothing happens there, I guess.
I think they'd also fall in the 100-foot stream buffer as well.
Exactly.
So I guess, Doug, I don't think it would impact the developer's calculations too much if we excluded the 40% or more.
But it is a layer of protection where we would really need to have them. I'm thinking about the property there on County Road 16. I don't know what you call that, but it's the mink property by the barn there. And, there was some activity there, and that's a steep slope. And we all, we had a lot of attention on that when that was happening. And it just, I don't know, it just makes me feel better anyway, that we have just that extra layer of protection for very vulnerable areas.
Well,
if we-
as someone who's well aware of that area, because my partner owns the other side of that creek,
Mhm.
17 acres, including to the middle of the waterfall. Yes, I'm concerned about that. Because even though he inherited that property and it is defined in the will to be left forever wild, shit happens.
Yeah, yeah, I
And,
agree.
a lot
Sure.
of people would not be happy if that property were developed and ruin a wonderful, wonderful natural resource. But anyway, you know, and it's not all a steep slope on his property.
No.
So I think if, you know, just looking at this map, there are a lot of areas that have the 15% to, I think it was,
15 to 25.
yeah, but the 40% or more is just a small part of it. So I don't
Yeah.
think it would affect too many areas unless it was, you know, like here or along the creeks that are
Right.
very, very steep and probably should be excluded.
Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
definitely.
But then you have areas like this where, you know, if this was I'm just picking them off the map. I don't know anything about, you know, what's there, but, you know, obviously a lot of slopes and you could put the houses here or something like that.
We have stuff on
These are probably forested areas, but, you know, they might have other things.
backs out here.
Okay. Well, if that makes sense, I will, if there's no objections, I will keep it as we show it here, 40% or more in a constrained and 15 to 40 in priority conservation assets.
Yep.
Yeah, and
Looks
we've
good.
got the steep slope laws back up too.
Yes, exactly.
And you made a good point about there's ways to accommodate development on steep slopes, 15%, but it needs to be done, you know, according to best practices. Great. Okay, moving on. So we did the calculation of the 40%. I had a policy question for all of you regarding the bonus. So to determine the density, you take the number of acres in the parcel minus the constrained land. You know, do a calculation with how many lots per acre are allowed in that zoning district, and that's your base density. If the project provides public open space, they're entitled to 15% additional units, which is it's enticement to include public open space. So I wanted to get some consensus from the group as to whether to keep that in the regulations.
I think it's fine. Because it does offer something to the town, you know, and it's in one particular case recently, it seems to will work out to be a great benefit to the town. So
Yeah, that's right.
I would leave it in there, and it's always up to the board. I mean, it's up to the town board to, you know, make that determination. And there may be cases where it's a benefit in the town's purview, and there may be cases where it isn't. So I would leave it as an option, an enticement, as you say.
Yeah, and that gives the town board a lot of flexibility to say yes or no.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, so no objections to that.
Let me
Yeah.
ask questions about that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm all of questions today, you guys.
Good.
The first question is, do we need to, or should we consider better defining the process on how they go about doing that? We kind of did it, you know, on the fly here recently as Terry was talking about a recent project, and I think it worked out fine. And we belted out that to the town board and the authorization, actually, the town board passed a resolution authorizing the planning board to grant up to as they're doing the site plan. But do we want to provide a little bit more guidance for somebody down the road in terms of how that process works. So that is something for you to think about. And then the second thing I wanted to ask about that is, what is any thoughts relative to, I know there's a section in that that says shall provide open space or basically public access space. Do you also want to add a caveat in there that, again, it's just a question, that at least one of the goals, the proposed project must be to further at least one of the goals of the town's comprehensive plan? Again, a lot of open space stuff in the comprehensive plan anyway, but just helping to, maybe entice the developer to be thinking about the comprehensive plan and associated with that, whatever the comprehensive plan is at that particular time.
So they would choose, is that what you're saying? A goal that they would deem appropriate or something that they would want to do, and that would be an additional, what? Incentive or something?
Right.
Or
So I'm saying use the existing language, the open, whatever it says. I don't have it right in front of me, but the public access to open space or whatever it is, and furthers at least one of the town's comprehensive plan goals.
so it's more like a narrative you're talking about than just an actual.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I think I've seen that before in statements regarding that. I think in this document, this revised code, I think there's something along that lines, isn't there? Where they could include that if they wish to, but here we're specifically asking them to.
I think it makes sense to include that even as part of the conservation plan. So
Yeah. The reason I like that is because it draws attention to the developer that, we're really serious about this. We take our comprehensive plan and all of our other, processes very to heart, and we're concerned about that. So it helps them to understand our intent.
yeah, and I don't think it would be, it should advance some of the goals of the comprehensive plan.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why would the town,
Yeah.
grant it? Okay.
Barb, the only thing I want to say on this, with that recent application we were talking about, the planning board spent a lot of time discussing whether the bonus was warranted or not. And it wasn't necessarily the number of lots increasing, but it was more of a concern, and this is something we can get into when we start talking about the conservation easement itself, as to the maintenance and ownership of the land that the public would have access to. And I think the town is sort of refraining from taking on additional property, so they wouldn't have ownership of the property. So we'd fall into the HOA. The HOA would be responsible for the maintenance of it, and it could be an issue as far as public traversing private property, even though it may be subject to an access easement granted to the town. So again, it's something we can talk about more on the conservation easement side of things, as to who and how that'll be maintained.
Yeah.
But that was the concern that the planning board had on this bonus issue.
Well, doesn't some of that come down to that negotiation or that drafting of that conservation easement? What kind of language is actually put in? What kind of teeth are actually put into that easement agreement? There could be something in there such as a long-term bond or something like that, that if the HOA does walk away from it, there's something that can be drawn upon by the town to maintain the trail system or whatever it is in the, in that agreement. So it just seems to me like you could put some teeth in it when you sit down to negotiate that easement.
Yeah, and that's also in the land management plan. That's part of the what the applicant is required to provide prior to the final plans. But I know Jeff Morrell had mentioned that this is a different type of HOA compared to what he has at Lakewood Meadows. That is a diminished covenant or something. I forget what he said in your meeting the other night, last week.
Yeah.
But this is a different type. So maybe there is just more teeth inherently in the formation of the condominium, the HOA.
So I guess I'm not really clear as how this relates to the bonus. Because certainly the conservation easement and the management plan, that's going to be, a lot of nitty gritty that would need to be set for every project.
In the last page of the standards and procedures, the outline that you gave us, there is a kind of a think sheet, I guess, permanent conservation easements required. And so there it talks about the entity will hold, maintain, finance, and enforce the provisions of the conservation easement.
Right.
And then it says in E, provisions if entity fails to perform. Well, we haven't filled that part out, what those provisions, if they fails to perform, but those are the things I think that Terry was talking about. So this, so it looks like we're going to be attacking that or looking at that when we get to that particular page. But, I think we're aware of it, that we need to have process here so that this is maintained, for a very long time. And that is going to be something that we'll be talking about, I guess, when we get to that permanent conservation easement section.
The configuration of the land, the management plan, the management structure, all of that.
The financing, all of that's important.
It's very legal, and I guess I'm not proposing any changes from what you have in your laws now, because they seemed pretty thorough. And I think they'd also require some of your attorney's input if those aren't adequate right now. But I wanted to get the main, the bonus. We're going to keep it. It's still town board approval. And I guess if you find that, adding the bonus would make it impossible to manage the open space, I guess, that's a possible conclusion. But I guess I see those as two different things, how to manage the open space and configure the open space.
Yeah.
Before you move on, I just had a question about the calculations. If your numerator includes a parcel with a lot of area that the developer is not going to develop, the conservation easement, the other constrained lands, can you end up squeezing in a lot more lots, which you probably wouldn't want, just using the calculation you put forward?
Well, it's not only about single family here. This is about multifamily also and townhomes. So, this is not a lot configure. It's not only just that, is what I guess I want to say.
Yeah.
I mean, you're trying to encourage smaller footprints, less impact, and which is not necessarily related to the number of units. That has to do with your development design. So, that's definitely part of the review process is what are the development standards and your footprint.
All right.
It's not always single family.
Yeah.
Lots. So they might be smaller, they might be townhomes. So that's again to the development standards. And if I wanted to skip forward to that, currently your regulations do require minimum lot sizes, which your former staff planner recommended be eliminated to give the developer and the planning board more flexibility to approve creative designs that do have a smaller footprint. So, I mean,
yeah.
While we're talking about that, that was a question I also had, whether you were okay with eliminating those minimum lot size requirements to allow for that flexibility in a conservation subdivision in order to achieve the goals of preserving important open space.
I think there would be some guarantee that that would be okay to eliminate the minimum lot size, because we're not eliminating, well, I'm not quite so sure here if we are or we aren't, if we eliminated that. What the calculation actually gives us is the number of lots. If we minimize that, that calculation, something has to change in order to make that calculation or to eliminate or something so that we have more lots if we're going to do smaller lot sizes. I don't know, I'm a little confused there how we could maintain, you know, some equality here. If the calculation proves that, okay, we've got 20, okay, lots that we can do 20 houses, and we eliminate lot sizes, then how many houses can we actually put on that?
Well, it'll still be 20, but they can go on a smaller footprint if you have if you don't have a minimum lot size.
But what becomes the new so-called minimum? I mean, 50 square feet? Yeah, I mean, absurd, but you know, I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like there should be some kind of minimum.
Well, the question is, can the planning board be responsible for reviewing that? I mean, the developer's going to need to sell
Well-
these, so they're looking at the market.
Yeah, the developer wants to sell, so the planning board, I mean, you know, given the planning board's experiences with all various applications and such, I don't know, maybe it is something that they're given that responsibility and authority to determine.
The
I know
minimum,
that conservation subdivision next to the hammocks recently went through. We used the 10,000 square foot lot size, but the developer asked for a waiver, and I think he's got, you know, around 9,000 square feet on the average of the lots, and it was done through a waiver process, and that's how he granted. So in a way, it's good to have a minimum lot size, but then it's up to the discretion of the planning board as to where they want to reduce that.
Yeah,
yeah, that's a fail safe, I guess.
you have to put our trust someplace.
Yeah, I agree with what you're typing, Barb.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I'll take another look at that and maybe we can get, you know, simplify it a little bit. I mean, it was like a 4-line thing about how you compute the minimum lot size depending on what's near it. And maybe I'll just consider.
And the minimum lot size is geared to a single family. But when you
Right.
start getting townhouses and configurations like they have at, you know, the villas where you got 4 on one lot, I guess, it gets a little, you know, iffy. So planning board discretion here, I suppose, is probably the main gatekeeper.
You get into that, Joyce, it is unique because it is a condo association and it's subject to a declaration of covenants. So lot areas don't necessarily apply too often in multi.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So maybe with the townhomes, multifamily, it could be case by case. I mean, setbacks still
Yeah.
apply.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In some cases, you have each townhome has a fee simple lot in the front and the back. In other cases, it's all land of the HOA,
Right.
including the maintenance of the outside of the building. So I guess it depends on the application.
Which
Yeah.
is why we suggested, you know, just leaving it open for flexibility, but so maybe the minimum for single families and flexible for other forms.
Yeah, it's really application specific, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So backing up a little bit to the conservation standards, so 40% needs to be preserved, excluding the unbuildable constraint, that's class 1. 80% of class 2, 40% of class 3 assets must be preserved. That's to drive the focus towards the highest priority resources. And we also include these buffer requirements. And again, all of these can also be waived by the planning board, but these would be in the regulations. 100 feet from wetlands, 100 feet from rare and vulnerable communities and forests, and in the strategic forest protection area, an active farmland in the farmland protection area. And 50 feet for woods and farmland outside of the strategic protection areas. They're kind of, guidelines, but, we thought it was important to include buffers in the design criteria as well for conservation assets.
If they're guidelines, should we change the wording from standards to guidelines, or would we rather leave it standards?
I think as you were talking about with the minimum lot size, these are the requirements, but waivers are allowed.
Okay,
So if a wetlands was on the border of a constrained land or part of a constrained land, there would have to be on the unconstrained land, 100-foot buffer between that and a home. Is that what you're
Yes,
saying?
that's the idea.
Yeah.
Okay. Which further constrains the development, but
Yeah, but then but the planning board is going to have the flexibility to decrease the lot sizes. So, you have a lot of flexibility, I think, if you run up against that kind of a problem.
And those buffer areas would be part of the 40%. They wouldn't be, they're part of the 40% protected. We just want those areas to be targeted when they're drawing their plan for what lands are going to be protected
okay.
by easement. So we want them to prioritize not only the resources, but a buffer area around those resources for protection.
Barb, if I could ask a question on
Yeah.
that first section where you reference conservation easement, and I'm also, this might not be the appropriate time, I'm also looking at your draft language. We do not allow conservation easements. Let's see if I say this right. So a conservation easement to the town cannot be on private property. There's a different section of the code can't be included in the buildable lot. So we've run into that before. And so now these parcels are standalone conservation easement parcels. So I'm just wondering if we need to be specific about that in this section, just to give clear direction to the developer. We've got multiple examples in the town of Canandaigua housing developments where the conservation easement crossed private property, and then it was
Oh, yeah.
it was basically eliminated.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's when we didn't know what we were doing back then.
Yeah.
Well, I think what you're saying is the buffer areas might or might not be included in the conservation easement area, but it
Yeah.
should be
So
shown as a buffer anyway.
yeah. So the actual easement itself, the easement area, if we're putting a permanent conservation easement on something, that would have to be standalone property.
We have that somewhere in here. I think I read that's what that said. It couldn't be already, it couldn't be privately owned.
Yes,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's
that's
in
in
there.
there in the regs.
Yeah, it's in here somewhere.
But that's, they can do a plan and then, you can do a plan for development and conservation, both. You might have some areas that are buffer areas that could be in a backyard. And then another area that maybe has the entirety of the woods. That's, so it wouldn't be part of the 40%, you're right. It would be in addition. If it turns out the configuration didn't lend itself to being part of the area preserved by conservation easement.
So your options for ownership of this easement would be either the town takes it over or it's an HOA. So you're creating HOAs almost in every development where you have a conservation easement. Is that true?
Unless there's another entity that, like a land trust or
Finger Lakes,
something.
yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Well,
Yes, so let's see, here they are.
Yeah, there is another section. I just found it under the draft. It's down in section 2, so, okay.
Yeah, and I did not really edit that section because it seemed solid, and I would like to get some input from, the town as to how that's been working. Here's the draft revised regulations, okay.
And it actually, on your list, it's page 10 and 11 there, Barb. But it's
Are you seeing the
requires
picture now?
the land management plan and everything. So it's in there. You have it in there.
Yeah.
And the details of how to design and configure the easement land is currently in your regulation, and we wanted to preserve that. And that'll be negotiated case by case. Okay, I guess I'd like to, if I could, just kind of walk through a quick example. Let's see. Go to the beginning. Slideshow from the beginning. It didn't do it. Let me try that again. Didn't do it, so. Okay, do you see that sample project?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, so we decided to go back in time and look at, if you were reviewing Stablegate right now, what would you see? Well, this is what it looks like today.
Oh, dear.
Get out the bulldozers.
This is an aerial photo from 2018. And, it looks like a nice neighborhood, right? This is what it looked like in 2006 when they were just partially developed. I had to go get a historical aerial that I didn't pay for, but this is what it looked like in 1994. So you can see the woods in the corner and in the south. It looks like there was a stream, but it's not mapped, so that's not included. And it looks like this area was farmed, but for the purpose of our review, we assumed it had been grown up to old field. So if you looked at this site, you'd see a silver maple ash swamp, which is a rare, vulnerable ecological community, old fields, and just pockets of slopey areas, really not significant steep slopes, but these would be, and of course we changed our minds on the steep slopes. These are probably less than 15%, so we'd move them to high priority easements. And this little pond, which is also classified as a federal wetland potentially, right? It's on the National Wetlands Inventory maps. So when you look at the percent of constrained land, it doesn't add up to too much, even if you add up all those areas of steep slopes and federal wetlands. It's just a 1/4 acre pond there, just over an acre and a half of constrained land, but 26 acres of maple ash, silver maple and ash swamp. And the rest of the site is old field, 63 acres for a total of a 90 acre site. So when you did your calculation, you'd have to preserve 20, 40%, 80% of the swamp, and 40% in total. So you'd have to preserve some of the old field as well as hopefully the entirety of the maple ash swamp, or at least 80% of it. So when we look at the site, it looks like some of this land is being caretaken by the people who live there as their backyards. So if you were going to do this again, what would you suggest? I'll let someone else say it.
Well, don't do it that way.
Yeah.
No private property on those easements.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been, and I would want to get
Yep.
input from an ecologist, to say, well, you've got this 26-acre woods
Yeah.
and a pond. How does that create a self-sustaining ecosystem? I'd really want to get an ecologist's perspective on that. And the other woods are here behind this, and that's just I'd want to get an ecologist perspective on how sustainable that is as a standalone ecosystem, because obviously this is surrounded by farmland on one side, and it would be surrounded by houses on the other side. So we'd want to get some input on how this can be retained as a self-sustaining ecosystem. And I don't know if people ever go out and, look at nature in there. I'm sure there are a lot of things, living there that,
Mhm.
it's a self-sustaining ecosystem potentially. But, I'd want an ecologist to know. So if you were going to retain that and make the conservation easement right there, and possibly even larger with, buffers around the open space, you'd be squishing the houses a little more, maybe have smaller lots, or maybe have different types of housing so that they are no single family. Of course, that would create a different type of community, or maybe just fewer lots. I mean, those would be your options if you did it again today. But I think you're right, Joyce. The main, the main goal of the conservation plan in this property would be to preserve the woods as a sustainable ecosystem here and here.
Yeah.
And create separate parcels, that would be protected by a conservation easement, with the guidance of an ecologist who could explain how best to do that.
Mhm.
And now creating an HOA to maintain it.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
A plan that, that has
I have a
some,
problem with that, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
or send it to a land trust who's interested, or whatever the mechanism is, it has to be sound.
Mhm.
So that was just a project we did, and they acknowledge it. It's like, these are woods, these are fields, and so that's just a quick example.
Well, the other thing that happened there, if I just could, Barb, with that particular development is the developer used the pond, the large pond, the stormwater drainage facility. It's not even a pond, it's a stormwater drainage facility on the other side. That area, they use that as open space for the 40% for the conservation easement, and then put it in, and it's obviously it's a stormwater pond, and then put it on across people's private property. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we've learned a lot since those days. But
Mhm.
Barb, did you figure out how many houses they would have been allowed to build based on that? Those-
Yes, I did. Let me pull that up.
So I think it's what, 95, I think, give or take, is what was constructed approximately.
Yeah, seems like I counted more than that, but
Yeah, I thought I counted more than that one time too, to be that's my development. That's where I live. So
yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, I did count that. So I counted that. I wasn't sure what the zoning was then.
Mhm.
So there's 90 acres, and if it's 1 acre zoning, they'd be allowed 90 houses, right? And I counted 110. Just counting, just counting up and down the streets. If they got a bonus, they would get 13 and a half more. So, they could build 110, but they would have had to reconfigure it for public access, maybe
Yeah.
have a little nature walk in the woods.
And then when you subtract out the constrained areas with the proposed code, you'd be looking at what, 60?
Well, there wasn't any really, the constrained areas weren't, there was just like 2 acres of constrained areas.
Okay.
it was just the federal wetland, the woods would be considered a priority conservation asset, being a
Yeah.
rare vulnerable community, so
Yeah.
they wouldn't be constrained. So
I'd like to ask a question. Doug, so if a conservation easement is taken over by the, I'm sorry, Chuck, homeowners association, and they crap out on it, does the town have a fund available to provide maintenance and ensure the integrity of that area? And if they don't, should they?
So the town has an open space fund. Let me answer it that way. So the town has an open space fund that the town board could decide what they wanted to do with that for the protection of open areas or conservation areas. But that also gets into a whole nother legal question with HOAs. So HOAs are actually required to be filed with the New York State Attorney General's office. And there's actually provisions in that what is to happen should they go away. Some of the older ones I know weren't set up the way that maybe we would set them up nowadays. Let me say it that way. And
Mhm.
so like, for instance, there's even one at Lakewood Meadows that really just got set up as a voluntary HOA. In the original section, what is that called? Something Point. Somebody help me out.
Waterford Point.
Waterford Point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Karen, theoretically, it shouldn't fall back on the town because of if it's done correctly and set up. But there is an open space fund that the town board could direct some money to.
Thank you. I'm not sure if that's safe, but you know.
I don't think it's safe for the previous ones. You're talking about Waterford Point. I mean, I don't know how that's not safe. And probably not either this development that we're looking at now. So, Stablegate. But from here, for a while, we've been more on top of this. And so, maybe we're only looking at a few vulnerabilities instead of a lot.
So just to go back to the computations, with the 90-acre site, if they were to preserve 40% of it, they'd need to preserve 36 acres. So 26 acres would be these woods here and here. And then presumably, there could be, they could build a recreation area around the pond, which isn't a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
But make it a single parcel that can be protected by a conservation easement, not across, 10 backyards.
Yeah.
Doug, does Stablegate have an HOA currently?
No.
No? Okay. So the maintenance of that basin is up to each individual owner who silos up through the basin. Okay.
Believe it or not, there is not an HOA, but there is a drainage district. And so the town actually does the maintenance on that and charges the drainage district, just really to complicate things.
Yeah.
I guess.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Makes the cheese more binding.
That's true.
This one is a real lesson.
Yeah.
Our
Yeah.
lesson is don't do that again, right?
Exactly.
Going through the exercise was, really helpful to kind of tweak the process and the steps. And that's reflected in the revised, draft that we sent out. So I guess our next step is, if you have any input in the revised, the specifics of it. I think we're getting close, Doug, to, finalizing this for, the next step, which would go to, was it the town board or the attorney?
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly that's why Mr. Davis is here. And on my screen, he's sitting right next to you. It goes to the town's ordinance committee.
Yeah.
So we can.
I wonder when that was going to be brought up.
They have nothing to do, right, Gary?
Yeah.
Going to start meeting on a weekly basis, Gary.
Well, Barb, I haven't had a chance to really go through it in detail. I know we got the revision yesterday, so if we could have a little bit of time to do that and then maybe reconvene as a committee and then hopefully we can tie it up and send it on to Gary.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Yeah, the changes that we talked about are pretty minor, so I think if you read it, you can get input back and we could meet again. Would it be okay to set another meeting today, Doug?
Yeah, of course. Yep.
Yeah.
Let's see what we got. Maybe in 2 weeks. The week of the 10th.
How about the 10th? Kick
Sounds
off
good.
the week, right? And I know that we may have a, a
Yeah.
lot of you might be involved on the 11th. We may have a groundbreaking ceremony, is I think trying to
Yeah.
be scheduled right now for the inclusive playground on the 11th. So
Right.
maybe stay away from the 11th, but
I'm good
Another
all
big-
day on the 10th. The 10th is good all day for me so far.
It's okay for me too.
That's good.
Fine.
Good.
Yeah,
you want to do the same thing, 10 a.m.?
10 a.m.
And so I guess I'd ask for your feedback by, next Thursday. Well, maybe sooner. Next Thursday's okay. I'll block off the 7th. Well, yeah, I mean, we'll probably, some of these might require conversation and some not, so. And we've got a training session next Wednesday, so that's why I say I probably won't
Mm.
think about it until
Yeah.
Thursday. So
Yeah.
by Thursday.
Barb, could you be sure to add me on to the email list? I don't think I'm on there.
Okay.
I didn't get any revisions.
And then I just sent Sarah a quick email. Sarah wasn't able to join us just because of her daughter's a little under the weather, but Joyce, I'll forward that to you, and Sarah will send out a update with the link information and stuff for May the 10th at 10 a.m.
Thank you.
So, and we'll want our comments by May the 6th. Say the end of the day. Well, I think we are in broad agreement on policy then. Just would look forward to your, as picky as you can be. Let's get it right before it goes to the town board. As much consistency, anything you can pick up. People who know me know I'm a big picture planner, so I rely on attorneys and detail-oriented process people to back me up. So thanks for anything you can find that isn't right. We did, vet it here in our office, but there's always things that other eyes can find that we haven't found. So, and again, we also just incorporated some that are in the current law, not having a lot of experience with how that's working. So, definitely the parts about the conservation easements, if you have any thoughts about improving that, I didn't really focus on that. I was really more focused on how to make these regulations work better from the point of view of conservation and focusing in on the resources. I think the biggest improvement was, it says anything in the NRI we want to include in a conservation subdivision, and it's really just a subset of the resources in the NRI that are appropriate for preservation in a conservation subdivision. All the other resources are to be considered, as with all of your conservation, all of your projects, as part of your typical project review. So we really wanted to zero in on the land resources and conservation easement appropriate resources in this revision. But while we're at it, we want to fix everything else that's wrong with it. So Any
I would ask Tom, do you have any comments? I know you've lived with this thing for years, and I know you have some certain opinions. Are we going in the right direction, you think?
I know we were crying out for some simplicity, but we haven't made it any simpler, sadly. And maybe it's one of those things that cannot be made simple. Yeah, I just think of the many times we tried to get Rocco, for one, to go through the steps and do the conservation analysis. So it's still going to be a monster effort to get the developer to sit down and actually identify assets and so on.
Yeah, that's been the biggest issue for the good of the
Yeah.
group. Doing the conservation analysis when it occurs. I mean,
Mhm.
a lot of them want to do it at preliminary plan, and by that time, you've already had your sketch plan where you laid out your lots. So you
Right.
really have to do your analysis almost before the sketch plan.
Yeah.
You put that together. So that's something we can look at in terms of the process.
But right now we're entering an era where this is really necessary and it's really
Yeah.
important. And the stricter the guidelines are, in my opinion, I know you have to press developers, and I feel sorry for you, and I would never want to be on the same board that you're on. But I believe that right now it is necessary to have these strict guidelines for developers, because they're not going to change unless it comes from us. And unless it comes from the homeowners, the people they serve. I worked in the building industry for almost 30 years, and believe me, they're not going to change unless the customer makes them change. And that's what we're trying to help do.
I definitely see some improvement in the language of the revision. It is more clear to me, from my point of view anyway, from the document that we've been working with now. We have been working with for years. And the one thing that I think is imperative is that we do what Karen and Tom are talking about. Get those calculations first, because once you do that, you're set. Then you know where you're going and what you have to work with. And I think that the developer benefits from that. But you're right, we do have to enforce that.
We try.
I know. Been there, done that.
Right?
But I think a big part of it is also not only us learning, and I'm excited, Barb, next week you've got the natural resource stuff that we're going to be talking about. The good news, one of the benefits of this whole Zoom thing is we record these sessions, and they're on the town's YouTube channel, so they're available to anyone. And even when we start talking about, after we get to a point where this is ready, we get to the point of training and understanding how to do these analysis, I think that'll go a long way in helping some of the developers too. And truthfully, we can point back to the developers and the engineers, and we can say, go look it up on the YouTube channel and learn how to do it, and then bring it into us. So.
Well, I'll also be able to give them a checklist, and look, you're not going any further until this is all done.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it is, we try to put the process in the regulations, but it's definitely not how they think. They're thinking about building first, conservation second, and we're really trying to change that.
Yeah, that's the mindset.
Barb, is there anything else?
I'm set, and appreciate everybody's attention and commitment, and look forward to the comments and meeting again in 2 weeks.
Awesome.
Thank you so
See you
much.
again.
Thanks,
See you
Barb.
again, Barb. Okay.
Great.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.
Good to see everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye now.